Under medieval feudalism in Europe, it was much harder to organise a large army, and thus Europeans had small armies and would invest in quality steel and other equipment. This is why medieval European battles had very low casualties, and why, for example, the Crusaders racked up insane KD ratios. And this is why the European population was expanding dramatically, and why the Black Death from 1347 onwards was so devastating to the continent. If it and any equivalent plague didn't happen, of course the obvious consequence would be a lot more Europeans much earlier on. But this would also mean labour would be much more plentiful and therefore much cheaper. In our timeline, the death of many peasants meant others were able to negotiate for better wages. In England, to counter this, the government introduced a law called the Statute of Labourers, which limited the amount you were legally allowed to pay a peasant, and this law led directly to the peasant revolt. Obviously, in this scenario, neither of those two things happen. So without these peasant revolts, feudalism might face fewer issues. Undoubtedly, life would be hard for the peasants with so much more competition and labour increasingly cheap as the population grows, but generally it's harder for oppressed people to organise when it's easier to blame other oppressed people instead of the ones doing the oppressing. Instead of having an explicit law from on high that they can blame for their low wages, peasants would likely blame other workers for bringing down wages. As such, it's much more likely that any popular revolts would be directed at marginalised communities, and there may be more pogroms and other such events. This could also lead to more proto-Protestant religious movements, but without the printing press they'd be unlikely to have a massive impact. Probably the biggest difference from there being no medieval plague would be that if the Middle Ages end, as they did in our current timeline with the discovery of a new continent, the huge European population would have flooded over much more dramatically. Indeed, so many European workers would potentially mean no transatlantic slave trade, but that's further into the future. Check the comments if you're interested in part 2 of this alternative history series.